My name is Angiers1, and I'm pleased to welcome you guys tonight to the PSU-sponsored event, Sex, Science, and Society, a conversation with Natalie Angiers. The Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan, student-run organization that seeks to foster campus dialogue on timely issues. We do so by bringing speakers together in order to represent multiple angles on various current events and debates. We do not intend to promote any single perspective, but instead encourage the campus community to challenge assumptions and consider unfamiliar points of view. Natalie Angiers began writing for the New York Times in 1990, covering genetics, evolutionary biology, medicine, and other subjects. Her column focuses on the fundamentals of science, using news events to explore the basic principles that govern the natural world. Before this, she was a staff writer for Discover magazine, the senior science writer for Time magazine, an editor at the women's business magazine Savvy, and a regular contributor to The Atlantic, Parade, American Health, Mademoiselle, and other magazines. She has also been a professor at the New York University's Graduate Program in Science and Environmental Reporting, and a professor at large at Cornell University. Ms. Angiers won a Pulitzer Prize in 1991 in the category of beat reporting. She has received numerous other honors, among them the AAS Westinghouse Award for Excellence in Science Journalism, the Lewis Thomas Award for Distinguished Writing in the Life Sciences, the Exploratorium Public Understanding of Science Award, the Barnard College Distinguished Alumna Award, and membership in the American Philosophical Society. Her books include Natural Obsessions, The Beauty of the Beastly, Woman, An Intimate Geography, and The Canon, a whirligig tour of the beautiful basics of science. Hosting our conversation with Ms. Angiers is Pomona's own Dr. Rachel Levin, Associate Professor of Biology and Neuroscience. Professor Levin teaches courses here on animal behavior, neuroethology, and ecological and evolutionary biology. She received her BS from Antioch College and her PhD in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University. Her research focus is animal reproductive behavior, both in the function of behaviors, such as animal language and mating strategies, as well as the hormonal mechanisms that underlie them. She and her students are also working on a study of biological influences on the development of transgender identity in humans that now has over 1,000 participants. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Angiers and Professor Levin.
Here's a little test. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're good.
Okay, great. Welcome to Pomona College. I want to point out that many of us here are long-term fans of yours and looking forward to this conversation. And it's my job here tonight to sort of set the context right now for how this is going to work and some of the rules and regulations according to PSU. And I want to begin by giving our conversation a context that I think illustrates the complex relationship that science has with society. And the example that I decided to use was from our understanding of ourselves. Beginning in 1993, geneticist Dean Hamer and a team of colleagues at the National Cancer Institute published a paper suggesting that they had found a small region of the X chromosome, which they labeled XQ28, which was likely to house a gene that could predispose a male to being gay. Now, if you were reading the media in those days, it was amazing. Time magazine had a cover with a little crawling, bald-headed, cute baby that said "Born Gay" across the top. U.S. News and World Report had a headline that said, "Is there a gay gene?" And a small newspaper on the East Coast, the New York Times, ran an article that said, "Report suggests homosexuality is linked to genes." My personal favorite was at Pride marches, there were suddenly sales rising of purple shirts that said, "Thanks for XQ28, Mom." But the more interesting thing that I think we can learn from tonight and engage in talking about tonight is the public reaction itself. Some gay activists were very angry, suspecting that the true goal of this research was to figure out how to eliminate the gay gene. Some people expressed relief, feeling that their identity was finally legitimized. Others from churches said that if one had the gene, it was just God's way of challenging you or testing you to see if you were capable of doing the right thing under pressure. Some said, well, this gay gene is weird and maladaptive, and there aren't really any other gay animals, so the gene must be a weird mutation. And finally, there were speculations about whether Hamer himself was gay, and that this colored his science. So amidst all these different points of view, what seemed to get lost, one of the things that got lost was the quality of the science. And 2 years after he published his paper, Hamer was called before the National Institute of Health to testify as to whether he had falsified his data or excluded data from study that were inconsistent with his hypothesis. A study 4 years after that used the same data, different statistical approaches, and found no significant result. So somehow the retraction of this story never made the big time, the cover of Science, or even a good headline in the New York Times. And the idea of the gay gene has somewhat faded from public consciousness. What happened to Hamer? He wrote 3 books, which are widely acclaimed and well-liked by reviewers on Amazon. One was called The Science of Desire, one was Living with Our Genes, and the last was The God Gene, all of which got 3 and 4 stars by Amazon reviewers like yourselves. So what can we take from this story? We can take that we tend to relinquish power to science when we ask for diagnoses or we ask to be legitimized. We can understand that we fear and complain about the power that science has when its results frighten us or upset us. And we then question what motivates these scientists and the science that they do. We feel duped and betrayed when subsequent research shows a scientific result to be wrong. So my point in starting us with this story is that it's a fascinating and complex relationship that we have with science, all of which, through which we can weave an idea about scientific literacy. Now, Natalie Angiers has been a science reporter and close observer of our relationship to science for over 20 years. So tonight we'll hear about her views on a number of timely topics and their history and her perspective over a couple of decades of watching. The PSU has asked that we converse for 45 minutes, and then we open for Q&A for the second 45 minutes. But if you really can't restrain yourself and must ask a question, I'm sure we're open to answering it before that. So I thought it would be nice to start, Natalie, with talking about how you became a science writer in the first place.
Okay, but before we get to that, I have to say that I was actually very skeptical of that report. Maybe it wasn't conveyed by the headline, but my story was certainly not gullible. So I guess I don't think the reporting on it was uniformly bad. It was an exciting topic. One of the things that you have to realize is that we can't sort of decide what's appropriate to report on. We can only do the best job possible, but we can't sort of say, well, I'm not going to report on this because it may be offensive, or even that somewhere down the line it's going to be overturned. You know, you just can do the best that you do when you report it. And I have to say, I tried to be pretty measured and skeptical about it. How did I get into science writing? Well, I actually think that it's a great opportunity to bridge the two cultures, as C.P. Snow called them, of the humanities and sciences, and I was always interested in both of them, and so I was kind of trying to find a way to bring them both together. But when I was back in college, there was very little science writing at that point, so I thought about starting my own popular science magazine for the general public. I just had this kind of dream that this would be a great way to spend a life. But then when I got out of college, I realized that starting a magazine was probably beyond the means of somebody at that point. I was just like 20. And so I started doing technical writing, and then heard about Time magazine starting up exactly the magazine I had fantasized about, which was going to be a popular magazine about science for the general public. And I applied for a job, and I got it, so I kind of was in on the ground floor at the beginning of what became Discover magazine. And it was a wonderful experience to see this all start up and to see this blossoming of this new field of science journalism, science writing, which took off after that. Everybody thought this was the wave of the future, and it was for a while. And then it kind of hit a wall, realizing that we weren't able to sell ads to people who wanted to buy Mercedes-Benzes and so on, but it wasn't actually appealing to that same dynamic, that same stratum of the public that we had been hoping to reach. Instead, it was really more of the popular science kind of tinkering crowd, and they're not the ones with as much of the disposable income. So you hit reality of the desire to transform society, hit the reality of the fact that the money wasn't there, and so things contracted after that. So it's been this crazy ride of just seeing this take off and then contract back again. We are now in a period of contraction that has been fairly depressing for those of us in the business, but at the same time, there are certain developments coming up that I think people can participate in more, and that is the whole phenomenon of online science writing. And we can talk a little bit about that, more about that as we go on. But it's a great opportunity to bring the two ways of looking at the world together. The sort of the rigor of the sciences together with the imaginative freedom of the humanities. And writing about science has been a glorious opportunity to do that.
So I'm sure, I know for a fact, there are students in the audience who would love to be science writers. What advice would you give to them in preparing themselves to pursue such a career?
The number one piece of advice I have for anybody who wants to write about science is to get a doctorate in science first. And even if you're not going to be a practicing scientist, I can tell you that nowadays most of the people who are coming into science writing do have a doctorate, and that it will give you the kind of flexibility throughout your career that a degree in journalism just won't. So you can then go on and take this doctorate, and you can write books, and you will be much more credible as a source than you will be without it. You can go into ancillary ways of doing science writing through science policy and other kinds of fields that involve really being very fluid with your writing skills. And it will serve you well for your entire life. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to just consider that the world is really, it's your candy store, and that you have to maintain the sense of curiosity and of wanting to understand everything. And one of the things that really inspires me about science writing, I get very depressed about the world in general. And if you live in Washington, as I do, and you see politics, and you can really think that humanity's really screwed up. And then you read about a new scientific discovery or just even a small finding, and I can tell you, you read these things like so wonderful. You can almost start crying. It's fascinating things that continue to be discovered, and science is good news with a forebrain, and so it just really keeps you going. It gives you faith in the future of humanity. And if you have that spirit, then go for it. And if you don't, forget it. I mean, if you're kind of just looking on it as almost a kind of a technocratic perspective, you have to come in there with that feeling like this is the greatest job on earth. And if you have that feeling, even in these bad economic times, you're going to find a place. I can guarantee you. The world needs more science writers with passion.
You started to answer one of the questions I wanted to ask at some point, which is, where do your ideas come from?
I think the important thing to realize is that every question that you have in your mind is going to be a question that other people will have. And so you might want to consider using your own experiences to give you that unique perspective. There's one thing to follow the news, and it's another thing to actually come up with ideas, and people really like that. For example, I did something recently on the color blue, and so what is our response to the color blue, and why does it make us feel this way? What are all the cultural interpretations of it, the sort of physiology of blue? I was reading something about the history of blue pigment, and just these kinds of awarenesses about the world around you are going to make the best stories. They're going to make the stories that people are really going to want to read. Or just another example that I had, this was something I did, I was putting on a pair of shoes, and I realized that women's shoes just feel, you know, they hurt your feet. And so, and it's not just the high heels, like the whole fit. I got to write about why women's shoes don't fit women's feet. And it turned out to have some surprising answers. It wasn't just, oh, well, you know, pointy toe and a high heel. There are other differences between the way they make men's and women's shoes that explain a lot about the difficulties that women have. But this is just sort of saying, I'm surely not the only person who's curious about this. It was an enormously popular story. But just to have faith that the observations you make about the world are probably going to excite other people too.
When do you choose to reveal something about yourself in your writing? You made what seemed to be a very intentional decision in around 2001 to write about being an atheist. And what motivated or prompted you to write that piece? What was the public response? And have you done similar things in other columns to date?
Well, you know, there's sort of two reasons to talk about yourself. Well, three reasons really. If you want to kind of, if you put yourself in the story and if you're writing about a field experience, then that I think is a legitimate thing to talk about from a personal point of view. Or you can just put yourself in it because it just makes for a more engaging narrative sometimes. You have to do it judiciously, not too often. But the real reason I did it in the case of the atheism story was I felt like things were getting out of control with religion starting to have too much of an impact on all of our discussions, including, you know, people like sensible politicians starting to say unsensible things because there was such pressure on them to state their religiosity. And I thought, this is out of control and it's going to hurt us. So I was going to just say, hey, look, I'm an atheist, and I know it's a lonely place to be, but I actually object to being force-fed sort of political public religion. And I actually have to say that I had an enormously positive response to that article. People just felt so relieved to have someone talking about it. They were feeling that same sense of this suffocating conformity that was being demanded of people. And just to have it come out. And since then, there have been, of course, there's this whole, what's called the New Atheist movement, people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and much more public speaking about it, but at that point it was pretty rare. But it was a very positive outpouring. I've written other things about atheism that have been a little bit more contentious. For example, when I was questioning why scientists would always say to me, you have to tell the public that evolution is real, because there are too many creationists who are claiming that, and they're starting to influence things too severely. So tell people that evolution is real. And I wrote an article saying, well, scientists, why stop there? Why not sort of question a lot of the other uncredible parts of religious dogma? Why not talk about the really tiny likelihood of resurrection or virgin birth or, you know, any of the other things, and talk about it from a scientific perspective. Forget about just what is the probability of this happening. So that one got more angry response.
From who? What was the response of the scientists?
Well, not so much scientists as people who, you know, other sort of philosophers or more high-minded kind of theologians. And I think one of the things that they always say is that I have a very narrow view of religion and that I'm being very simple-minded in how I'm analyzing religion. But one of the objections I have to that is that you never really spell out what what exactly it is that you believe that is beyond this narrow definition of religion. But anything that involves a supernatural component, any perspective on religion that has anything supernatural about it, I think is open to serious questioning. Just asking for, you have to specify what you're talking about, what the evidence is, and so on. All of that is fair game.
So do you think scientists have an obligation in this regard?
Probably not, because they're already hurting for money. I really don't want to completely throw them under the bus. I mean, people are entitled to their faith, and I know some very religious scientists, certainly, but I think that we have an obligation to speak out when it starts to affect things beyond that particular, that domain of their, whatever it is they believe in, whether it starts to spill out and influence science more generally. One of the questions is, should we try to find common ground between religion and science? And that's, of course, an ongoing question, and there's the Templeton Foundation sort of devoted to that. I'm actually more of the Stephen Weinberg opinion that science works best when religion has nothing to do with it. It just has nothing to do with religion. That religion kind of presupposes an answer that you're looking for, and you just don't want to have that happen in science.
So let's talk longer about the relationship between science and politics and the divide that seems to be growing in opinions about science over the last number of years. How, and the role of religion in that. Science has somehow become politicized and viewed as a liberal conspiracy. How has that happened? What role have scientists played in that? And where do you see that heading?
It's, I think, a kind of a dangerous point in history. Well, during the last election, when there was the second time that a huge number of Nobel laureate scientists signed a petition basically endorsing Obama for re-election. Now, I thought that was a good thing, and in terms of, my husband actually works in the White House, and so, you know, okay, I want him to keep his job too, but one thing that worried me about that was, what happens if Romney won? What does that mean about the relationship between science and a major political party? Only recently have we had this kind of split between scientists, and the Republican Party has actually been pretty good until recently on supporting science. And by supporting, I mean financially supporting as well as just thinking it was good for the country and for our economy. And only recently has there been this kind of growing hostility. And I do think that a lot of that has to do with the influence of the religious right on the Republican Party. And that's been very dangerous. I see that as really, that threatens our entire enterprise, because they do hold the purse strings. I mean, that's the Republicans in the House. And so how are they going to be doling out money? They're now trying to get rid of, there's a very active campaign right now, and they may succeed in cutting off all NSF funding for social science and anything having to do with psychology, social science, political science, all of that, no more federal funding of that. Because they see it as a political move, that this is a way of sort of cementing the Democratic Party in power. It shouldn't be seen that way. And once you cut out the social sciences, you can start to see other things kind of being dragged along with it. Where is that going to take neuroscience, which is, you know, kind of sometimes straddles the social and life sciences. And so we don't want to have that happen, but that's the direction we're going in now. And it's kind of disturbing to me. So how are we going to, what are we going to do to turn that around? And this is where I've also been on my kind of campaign to get more scientists involved in science policy, more scientists going to Washington and actually talking to Congress and, you know, doing congressional testimony and lobbying. There have to be more people who are in the sciences who are out there trying to influence how dollars are going to be doled out. And also, more scientists involved in politics itself, more scientists running for election at all levels of government. That's going to be one way to, I think, slow down this trend.
You wrote a number of years after your article on atheism in Canon, a whirly tour of the beautiful basics of science, which is one of my favorite titles, which was described as a thoroughly entertaining guide to scientific literacy. And I think literacy has to play into this. So what prompted you to write that relative to these issues, and who was your intended audience?
Well, I've always been interested in basic scientific literacy and also basic science. One of the things about when you're, a reporter and you have to worry about the news is you kind of don't get to write as much about the background of all the science that's already there. And so, to me, that's actually very often the most interesting part, is what this is sort of, this news story is built on. So I wanted to just provide the basics for that. I do think that scientific literacy is important, and for the reasons that we've been talking about, that the more people care about science, the more they're going to be upset if they hear that there's been this cut in funding for basic research, the cut in funding for certain kinds of research. That will definitely have an impact. The better choices they'll make in voting. So in talking about ways to get people more scientifically engaged, there's some interesting options that come up. I also want to point out that people like scientists. Did you know that scientists are the second most respected profession in the United States after firefighters? I was surprised too, but people like scientists. They like science. They're intimidated by it, but they really like it. And I can also say that most emailed stories are very often science stories. People are interested in science. People want to hear more about it. More scientists should go out and talk to the public. People love it when scientists give talks. Scientists should go out to schools, and by schools I mean like middle schools, high schools, and talk. I think there has to be much more engagement of scientists in the general community. Most people never get a chance to meet a scientist. They meet doctors, lawyers, business, but they don't meet scientists. If they meet scientists, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, so this is real. So that I think is important. Science writers can only sort of handle a small part of this larger issue of scientific literacy. But I do think that there are ways to engage the public that are increasingly coming to the forefront. Citizen science. I actually really like this trend of citizen science where people are doing things like bird counts or bloom count, bloom timing, and going along and tagging all sorts of animals out in the wild. And there's this other example that's recently come up called TED, this Twitter earthquake dispatch, which is really, I just learned about this, where they detect these sizable earthquakes before the seismographic equipment can, just by people in different locations. They're sending tweets on, they have this, using the GPS data and local data, and so these tweets are telling scientists about where these the path of the earthquake and so on. This is citizen science. This is people being engaged in science. And one thing you find is that when people get involved in these kinds of projects, they are no longer afraid of science, and it kind of spills over into their more general life of following science and being interested. That's actually been shown. The people who are involved in things like the winter bird count are much more engaged in the scientific enterprise generally, just because they feel like they're part of it.
I think that there's still a sort of mystique about science. What you were saying made me remember being in graduate school, and I knew absolutely nothing about birds at the time. And it had been suggested that I divorce myself from my previous work in primates and address the issues I wanted to address using birds for my dissertation. So I dutifully went out and found a local bird in Ithaca, New York, that I could study to see if I could even handle working with little feathered, dumb, non-mammalian creatures. And there were, as it turned out, the perfect bird I wanted to study, there were 6 males in Ithaca, New York. So I went and visited the houses where these birds lived. And each of the women who lived, they tended to seek out, these birds would nest in the houses of single old women. And they would invite me in and they would tell me gobs of science about their Carolina wren. And when they'd say, oh, but you're the scientist. And I think, oh my gosh, you just told me everything there is to know, and yet I'm the specialist and they're not the scientist. I think we have a dying question. Yes.
Not so dying. 2 weeks ago, I think it was, we had a week-long lecture series from a woman named Susan Solomon, who came and spoke on her research on climate change and such. And sort of the thesis of the week for her was that each of us should get more involved in talking about climate change, should research and share what we find with the public. So I'm curious sort of what your perspective has been on the public discussion of climate change, sort of relating to what you've been saying about how we should be talking about it.
Well, one of the problems has been that the economy just came and blew all that away. And, it's interesting because when Al Gore's movie first came out, there was this huge popular response, and people claimed much more concern and conviction about climate change. And then when that faded from the public eye, so too did any expression of concern about it. So we do need to sort of keep these things front and center. I think one of the things that's interesting is for people to continue to be skeptical about it when not only that all the data show, but our modeling has gotten really good in a lot of ways. People may not realize that this, for example, not this meteorite, but the asteroid, that we were able to track it very, very precisely, and we were able to track Hurricane Sandy very, very, really with amazing precision. I mean, what happened as a result of it is not always known. You don't know that the New York subways are going to flood or whatever the particulars are going to be. But we were able to track that. We could track it. We can track things. We know. So don't be so skeptical, right? I mean, we are actually probably a lot of these climate models they're really good, and this is what's going to happen. This is what is happening. So the skepticism is really misplaced. And I do think it's more of the obligation falls on scientists than on journalists to keep pointing this out, because no matter what you say about science journalists, there's a limit to how much of advocacy journalism they can practice, even when the answer is as clear as evolution, even when it's as clear as climate change. You can talk about it as though you accept it as reality, but you can't keep really in sort of standard mainstream journalism, there is definitely a limit to how much you can sound like you're waving a flag for anything. So I think it is more up to the scientists to really just keep speaking out about it rather than to complain that the journalists aren't doing enough, just because there really are much more severe limitations on how much an advocacy role journalists can or should be playing on any subject.
But where do you think the resistance comes from climate change?
I think that it comes from the Republican Party at this point. I really do. I think that the resistance comes from the fact that there's a lot of oil and gas money involved, and there's an interest in not having people be concerned about it. And I really think it's it's more of that than anything else. So they're just gonna continue to hammer away at it because there's just billions of dollars involved. It's unfortunate but true.
Well, let's shift gears before we run into the Q&A, because I know that one of your most well-read books on campus is Woman and Intimate Geography. And this book has been seen by many as an antidote to an inherently male binary view about the science of women, sex, and sex differences. So again, I want to ask you, given the climate, what prompted you to write that?
Well, it started off being actually, I wanted to write a book just about human anatomy generally because I felt like there wasn't a good general interest book about it. And it was my editor who said, why don't you write about women's bodies instead of just bodies. I said, okay, that sounds like a great idea. And then when I got into it, I decided to kind of expand it beyond just anatomy to talking about taking it from a very small, so from a kind of chromosomal level up to behavioral. And that's when I ran into the whole evolutionary psychology movement, which has had such an impact. And I thought that they had a very, speaking of a narrow view, I thought that they had a very narrow view of male and female behavior that was becoming kind of almost calcified by the acceptance of some of their claims. So I felt like somebody had to come up and present just a more open-minded perspective on it. So that's why I focused on that. And I really think it's important to think, to apply Darwinian logic to understanding our bodies and our behavior. But I also think it's important to really be very, very, very sophisticated in how we do that. For example, a lot of the evolutionary psychologists say, well, that has nothing to do with science. Your perspective is political, not scientific. And then